In a world where celebrity messages often feel hollow and scripted, one woman's words on a February morning in 26 would cut through the noise with such raw authenticity that millions would stop scrolling, put down their phones, and truly listen. The Princess of Wales was about to deliver a message that would not only mark World Cancer Day, but transform how the world viewed courage, vulnerability, and the true meaning of royal duty. What made this particular address so extraordinary wasn't just who was speaking, but what she had endured to earn the right to these words. Behind the composed exterior and carefully chosen phrases lay a journey through the darkest valleys of human experience. A journey that had tested every fiber of her being and emerged with a message of hope that would resonate far beyond palace walls. This is the story of how Catherine, Princess of Wales, became not just a royal figure, but a beacon of light for millions fighting their own battles against cancer. It's a tale of personal struggle transformed into public service, of private pain becoming a source of collective strength, and of how sometimes the most powerful crown a person can wear is the wisdom earned through surviving life's greatest challenges. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Adelaide Cottage as Catherine, Princess of Wales, sat quietly at her desk, her fingers hovering over the keyboard of her laptop. It was February 3rd, 2026, and tomorrow would mark World Cancer Day. The irony wasn't lost on her that exactly 2 years ago, she never could have imagined she would be preparing to address millions of people about a disease that had become such an intimate part of her own story. She glanced at the framed photograph on her desk, a candid shot of her 3 children laughing in the garden, their faces bright with the kind of carefree joy that she had fought so hard to preserve throughout the most challenging period of their young lives. Prince George, now 13, had grown taller and more serious in the past year. Princess Charlotte, 11, still maintained her spirited personality but carried a new depth in her eyes that spoke of wisdom gained too early. And Prince Louis, 8, continued to be their family's source of light and laughter, though he too had learned lessons about strength and resilience that most children his age would never need to know. The journey that brought Catherine to this moment began in early 2024, when routine medical checks revealed something that would change everything. She remembered the sterile smell of the hospital room, the way the oncologist's voice seemed to echo from far away as he explained the diagnosis. The word cancer had hung in the air like a physical presence, transforming her world in an instant from one of royal duties and public appearances to one of treatment schedules and uncertain tomorrows. In those first few days after the diagnosis, Catherine had felt the weight of multiple identities pressing down upon her. She was a mother who needed to protect her children from fear while being honest about reality. She was a wife to Prince William, watching him struggle between his natural instinct to shield her and his respect for her independence. She was the Princess of Wales, with millions of people around the world who looked to the royal family for stability and inspiration. And underneath all of these roles, she was simply Catherine, a woman facing one of life's most frightening challenges. The decision to step back from public duties hadn't been easy. For years, Catherine had built her royal identity around visibility and service. She had become known for her hands-on approach to her patronages, her genuine interactions with the public, and her dedication to causes close to her heart. The thought of disappearing from public view, even temporarily, felt like abandoning the people who had embraced her as their future queen. But her medical team had been clear about the demands of treatment, and her family had been even clearer about their priorities. Prince William had been her anchor throughout the early weeks of treatment. She recalled one particularly difficult evening when the side effects of chemotherapy had left her feeling like a shadow of herself. She had been sitting in their private sitting room, wrapped in a soft blanket, when William had quietly entered and sat beside her. Without saying a word, he had simply held her hand, and in that moment she had felt the full weight of their partnership. This was what, in sickness and in health, truly meant. Not just words spoken in Westminster Abbey years ago, but a lived reality that deepened their bond in ways she had never anticipated. The children had each responded to her illness in their own way. George, being the eldest, had initially tried to take on a protective role, asking careful questions about her treatments and whether she was eating enough. His maturity had been both heartbreaking and inspiring to witness. Charlotte had channeled her energy into small acts of care, bringing her mother drawings and stories, and insisting on helping with simple tasks around the house. Louis, perhaps understanding less about the medical specifics but sensing the family's need for lightness, had continued to be himself with such determined cheerfulness that it became a form of medicine all its own. As the months of treatment progressed, Catherine began to see her experience through a different lens. The fear and uncertainty were still present, but they were joined by something unexpected, a profound sense of connection to the countless others walking similar paths. In the chemotherapy suite, she sat alongside people from all walks of life, each fighting their own battle with the same disease that didn't care about titles or social status. There was Mrs. Henderson, a retired teacher who had been battling breast cancer for 3 years and who shared stories of her grandchildren with the same fierce pride Catherine felt for her own children. There was James, a young father who worked construction and whose determined optimism reminded her that courage came in many forms. These relationships, formed in the most unlikely of circumstances, began to reshape Catherine's understanding of what her platform as Princess of Wales could truly mean. She had always been committed to a charitable work, but now she felt a calling that was deeper and more personal than anything she had experienced before. The abstract concept of service became concrete and urgent. She wasn't just supporting causes, she was living the reality that millions of families faced every day. The medical team had been cautiously optimistic about her response to treatment. The specific type of cancer she was dealing with, while serious, had been caught at a stage where aggressive treatment offered good prospects for recovery. But Catherine quickly learned that cancer treatment wasn't just about the physical battle. The emotional and psychological challenges were equally demanding. There were days when the uncertainty felt overwhelming, when the simple act of planning for next week seemed impossible because the future felt so fragile. During these difficult periods, she found herself drawing strength from unexpected sources. Letters from cancer survivors around the world began arriving at Kensington Palace, each one sharing a piece of someone's journey through diagnosis, treatment, and recovery. The stories varied widely, but common themes emerged: the importance of hope, the power of community support, and the way that facing mortality could actually deepen appreciation for life. One letter from a young mother in Australia who had been diagnosed with the same type of cancer particularly resonated with Catherine. The woman wrote about how her diagnosis had initially felt like a theft of her future, but how treatment had taught her to value each day in ways she had never imagined possible. She described watching her children play in the garden during her recovery and feeling a kind of gratitude so intense it was almost overwhelming. This perspective began to influence how Catherine approached her own healing journey. The isolation required during certain phases of treatment had been one of the most challenging aspects of the experience. Catherine was accustomed to a life filled with public engagements, meetings, and constant activity. The quiet weeks at home, while necessary for her recovery, had felt strange and sometimes lonely. But gradually, she began to appreciate the enforced slowness of this period. She read books that had been sitting on her shelf for years, spent long afternoons with her children without the pressure of scheduled activities, and had conversations with William that meandered without agenda or time constraints. It was during one of these quiet periods that the idea for her World Cancer Day message began to take shape. She had been reading stories shared by cancer patients and their families, and she was struck by how many people felt isolated in their experiences. Despite cancer affecting millions of people worldwide, individual patients often felt alone with their fears, their questions, and their hopes. Catherine began to envision using her platform not just to raise awareness about cancer in general terms, but to speak directly to this sense of isolation. The response from the public during her treatment period had been overwhelmingly supportive, but it had also revealed something important about the relationship between the royal family and the people they served. When Catherine's diagnosis was announced, the outpouring of support came not just from the usual royal watchers, but from people who had faced similar challenges themselves. Cancer patients, survivors, and their families felt a personal connection to her story that transcended the usual boundaries of royal public relations. This connection became even more apparent when she made her first tentative return to public appearances in late 2024. The warmth of the reception was unlike anything she had experienced before. People approached her with a different kind of recognition in their eyes, not just acknowledgement of her royal status, but something deeper and more personal. She was no longer just the Princess of Wales. She was someone who had walked through the same valley of shadows that they or their loved ones had navigated. As her health steadily improved through late 2024 and into 2025, Catherine began to carefully increase her public engagements again. But she approached these responsibilities with a changed perspective. Every interaction felt more precious and more purposeful. When she visited children's hospitals, she saw not just young patients but individuals fighting battles that required extraordinary courage. When she attended charity galas for cancer research, she wasn't just fulfilling royal duties but advocating for work that had immediate personal relevance to her own life. The medical team had been pleased with her progress throughout 2025. Regular scans showed positive responses to treatment, and her energy levels gradually returned to something approaching normal. But Catherine had learned that recovery from cancer wasn't just about returning to how things were before. The experience had changed her in fundamental ways, and she didn't want to simply go back to business as usual. She wanted to use what she had learned and the unique perspective she had gained. Now, as she sat preparing her World Cancer Day message for 26, Catherine reflected on how much had changed in the 2 years since her diagnosis. The woman who had first heard those frightening words in the oncologist's office felt like a different person from the one sitting at this desk now. The fear was still there, would probably always be there to some degree, but it was balanced by something else, a deep sense of purpose and an understanding of how precious and fragile life could be. She thought about all the people she had met during her treatment, the letters she had received, and the conversations she had had with cancer patients during her recent public appearances. Tomorrow, she would speak not just as the Princess of Wales, but as someone who had lived the reality of cancer, diagnosis, treatment, and recovery. Her words would carry the weight of personal experience, and that both thrilled and sobered her. The cursor blinked on her laptop screen as she began to type, knowing that tomorrow's message would be one of the most important speeches of her life. The February morning of World Cancer Day 2026 dawned crisp and clear, with golden sunlight streaming through the windows of the private study at Kensington Palace, where Catherine had chosen to record her message. She had spent considerable time deciding on the setting for this address, ultimately choosing a space that felt personal and intimate rather than formal and institutional. Behind her sat a bookshelf filled with volumes that had provided comfort during her treatment period, and a small table held photographs of her family, alongside flowers sent by well-wishers during her recovery. The technical team had arrived early to set up the recording equipment, working quietly and efficiently to create the right atmosphere. Catherine watched them work, remembering the many times over the past 2 years when medical equipment had filled her world with similar precision but entirely different purpose. The irony wasn't lost on her that technology which had once been used to monitor her illness was now being used to share her message of hope with the world. Prince William had stayed close throughout the morning, offering quiet support without being intrusive. He understood the significance of this moment for Catherine, not just as a royal duty, but as a personal milestone. This message represented her full return to public service, but more than that, it marked her transformation from cancer patient to cancer advocate. Over breakfast, he had simply squeezed her hand and said, "You're going to help so many people today," and those words had settled her nerves more than any formal preparation could have done. The children had each contributed to the morning in their own way before leaving for school. George had given her an unexpected hug and whispered, "I'm proud of you, Mama." Charlotte had left a small drawing on her desk showing a woman with a crown made of flowers, with the words, "Strong Princess," written in her careful handwriting. Louis had simply asked if she was going to tell people about being brave, and when she nodded, he had declared with 8-year-old certainty, "Good, because you're the bravest person I know." These moments of family support had reminded Catherine why this message mattered so much. As the recording time approached, Catherine took a few quiet moments to review the key points she wanted to convey. She had written and rewritten her remarks multiple times over the past several weeks, working with her communications team to find the right balance between personal reflection and public inspiration. The challenge was to share enough of her own experience to make a genuine connection with others facing similar challenges, while maintaining appropriate boundaries around her family's privacy. The decision to speak openly about her cancer journey hadn't been made lightly. There had been extensive discussions within the royal household about how much personal detail was appropriate to share. Some advisors had suggested keeping the message more general, focusing on cancer awareness and research rather than personal experience. But Catherine had felt strongly that her unique position carried with it a responsibility to use her voice in the most authentic and helpful way possible. She had drawn inspiration from other public figures who had shared their cancer journeys, studying how they had managed to be both personal and purposeful in their communications. What had struck her most was how powerful it could be when someone in a position of influence acknowledged the fear, uncertainty, and vulnerability that came with a cancer diagnosis. Too often, public conversations about cancer focused only on triumphant recovery stories, which, while inspiring, could make people in the midst of treatment feel even more isolated if their own experience didn't match that narrative. The recording began with Catherine speaking directly to the camera, her voice steady but warm. She had chosen to begin by acknowledging World Cancer Day specifically, but quickly moved to more personal territory. She spoke about the moment she received her own diagnosis, describing the way time seemed to stop and the world seemed to shift on its axis. She was careful not to provide specific medical details, but she was honest about the fear and uncertainty that had characterized those early days. "When you hear the word cancer applied to your own life," she said, looking directly into the camera, "everything else fades away. The meetings on your calendar, the plans you had made, even your sense of who you are. It all becomes secondary to this new reality you're being asked to face. And in that moment, you realize that cancer doesn't care about your title, your responsibilities, or your plans. It simply is, and you have to find a way to be stronger than you ever imagined possible. As she continued speaking, Catherine felt the familiar sensation of connecting with an audience that she had experienced during her most meaningful public engagements. But this felt different, more intimate despite the distance created by the camera. She was speaking to people she couldn't see, but whose experiences she now understood in ways she never had before. She thought about Mrs. Bick Henderson from the chemotherapy suite, about the young mother from Australia who had written to her, about all the families she had met who were walking this difficult path. She spoke about the importance of support systems, drawing on her own experience of how family, friends, and medical professionals had created a network of care around her. But she was also honest about the loneliness that could exist even within the most loving support system. The way that certain fears and questions could only be understood by someone who had faced them directly. There were nights, she shared, when I lay awake thinking not just about my own future, but about my children's futures, about all the moments I might miss, all the ways this illness might change our family's story. And I know I'm not alone in having those thoughts. Every parent facing cancer has wondered about school plays they might not attend, graduations they might not see, weddings they might not dance at. These fears are part of the journey, and acknowledging them doesn't make us weak or pessimistic. It makes us human. The conversation turned to the theme of hope, which Catherine had thought about extensively during her preparation. She wanted to talk about hope in a way that was realistic rather than naive, that acknowledged the genuine challenges while still offering encouragement. She spoke about how her understanding of hope had evolved during treatment, from something that felt fragile and desperate to something more robust and grounded. Hope isn't just about believing everything will be okay, she explained. Sometimes hope is just about believing you can handle whatever comes next. It's about finding meaning in each day, even when you're not sure how many days you have. It's about discovering strength you didn't know you possessed and connection you didn't know was possible. She shared some of the lessons she had learned from fellow patients, being careful not to identify anyone specifically, but drawing on the wisdom that had been shared with her during treatment. She talked about the importance of celebrating small victories, of finding joy in simple moments, and of accepting help when it was offered. These weren't groundbreaking insights, but coming from someone who had lived them, they carried additional weight. The technical crew remained invisible during the recording, but Catherine was aware of their presence and their skill in capturing not just her words, but the emotion behind them. She had worked with television crews many times before, but this felt different. She was trusting them to help her share something deeply personal with millions of people, and their professionalism and sensitivity were evident in every aspect of their work. As the recording continued, Catherine addressed directly those who were currently in treatment. She spoke about the strange way that normal life continued around you when you were fighting cancer, how the world kept moving at its usual pace while your own life had shifted into an entirely different rhythm. She talked about the difficulty of maintaining hope on the hardest days and the unexpected gifts that could emerge from the deepest challenges. To anyone watching this who is currently in treatment, she said, I want you to know that you're not alone in finding this incredibly difficult. You're not weak if you're scared or if you have days when hope feels impossible to maintain. What you're doing right now, the simple act of continuing, of getting through each day, is one of the most courageous things a human being can do. She also addressed families and friends of cancer patients, drawing on her observations of how her own diagnosis had affected Prince William and their children. She spoke about the helplessness that loved ones often felt, the desire to fix something that couldn't be easily fixed, and the importance of simply being present, even when words weren't adequate. The message took an important turn when Catherine began discussing the broader implications of her experience. She talked about how facing cancer had changed her understanding of her role as Princess of Wales, how it had deepened her commitment to health-related causes, and given her new insight into the challenges facing the healthcare system. This experience has shown me that behind every cancer statistic is a family dealing with fear, hope, logistics, and love all at once, she said. It's reminded me that public service isn't just about attending events or cutting ribbons. It's about understanding the real challenges people face and using whatever platform you have to make those challenges a little more manageable. She announced several new initiatives that she would be launching in partnership with cancer organizations focused specifically on supporting families during treatment and providing resources for the emotional aspects of cancer care that were often overlooked. These weren't just charitable commitments for Catherine, they were personal missions born from her own experience of navigating the cancer journey. The recording concluded with Catherine speaking directly to the camera one final time, her voice carrying both the weight of her experience and the lightness of genuine hope. She talked about the privilege of being able to share her story, and about her commitment to using that privilege to support others facing similar challenges. World Cancer Day reminds us that we're all part of a global community of people touched by this disease, she said. Whether you're a patient, a survivor, a caregiver, a researcher, or simply someone who wants to help, you have a role to play in creating a world where no one faces cancer alone. Together, we're stronger than any challenge, including this one. As the cameras stopped rolling, Catherine felt a profound sense of completion. The message she had just recorded represented not just a return to her public duties, but a transformation in how she understood those duties. She was no longer just the Princess of Wales who happened to have had cancer. She was someone whose experience with cancer had fundamentally shaped how she would approach her role as a future queen. Within hours of the Princess of Wales's World Cancer Day message being released across all major platforms, the response began to pour in from around the globe. Social media feeds filled with heartfelt reactions. News outlets provided extensive coverage. And most importantly, cancer patients, survivors, and their families found themselves feeling seen and understood in ways they hadn't expected from a royal address. The communications team at Kensington Palace had anticipated significant interest in Catherine's message, but the scale and depth of the response exceeded all expectations. The video was shared millions of times within the first 24 hours, but more significantly, it sparked conversations about cancer that went far beyond typical awareness campaigns. People weren't just acknowledging the disease. They were talking openly about the fear, the uncertainty, the small victories, and the profound changes that came with a cancer diagnosis.
Doctor.
Sarah Matthews, a leading oncologist at one of London's premier cancer centres, was among the first medical professionals to comment publicly on the princess's message. She had actually been part of the consulting team that had advised on the medical accuracy of Catherine's remarks, ensuring that her personal experience was shared in a way that would be helpful rather than potentially misleading for others facing cancer. What makes this message so powerful, Dr. Moll? Matthews explained to reporters, is that it comes from someone who has actually lived the experience she's describing. The princess didn't just talk about cancer in abstract terms or focus solely on positive outcomes. She acknowledged the real challenges, the fear, the uncertainty that every cancer patient faces. That kind of honest representation can be incredibly validating for people who are struggling with their own diagnosis. The response from cancer organizations worldwide was equally enthusiastic. Macmillan Cancer Support, Cancer Research UK, and similar organizations in dozens of countries reported unprecedented spikes in website traffic, volunteer applications, and donations in the days following the message. But more importantly, they saw increases in people reaching out for support services, suggesting that Catherine's words had encouraged people to seek help when they needed it. Maria Rodriguez, whose husband had been battling lung cancer for 8 months, watched the princess's message from their home in Manchester and found herself crying for the first time since his diagnosis. I didn't realize how much I needed to hear someone else say those things, she later shared with local reporters. When she talked about the nights lying awake worrying about all the moments you might miss, I felt like someone finally understood what this was really like. It wasn't just about being strong or fighting bravely, it was about being human and scared and still finding ways to hope. The international response was equally moving. In Australia, the young mother whose letter had influenced Catherine's thinking about her cancer journey watched the message with her own children. She immediately wrote again to Kensington Palace, this time to thank the princess for validating experiences that often felt impossible to put into words. Her letter, which was later shared with Catherine's permission, captured what many were feeling.
You gave voice to thoughts I had but didn't know how to express.
You made me feel less alone in this journey. Social media platforms became filled with personal stories, shared using hashtags that had emerged organically from the princess's message. #NotAloneInCancer and #Catherine's Community Care became gathering points for people to share their own experiences, offer support to others, and discuss the practical and emotional challenges of dealing with cancer that were so often overlooked in public conversations about the disease. Perhaps most significantly, the message sparked conversations within families that had been struggling to discuss cancer openly. Parents found ways to talk to their children about diagnosis and treatment. Adult children found language to discuss their fears with aging parents facing cancer. Spouses discovered ways to communicate about uncertainty and hope that felt authentic rather than forced. The ripple effects extended into healthcare settings as well. Nurses and social workers reported that patients were arriving at appointments with new vocabulary for their experiences, better able to articulate their emotional needs alongside their medical concerns. The message had provided a framework for discussing the psychological aspects of cancer care that medical professionals had long recognized as crucial, but sometimes struggled to address. Prince William had watched the global response to Catherine's message with a mixture of pride and protective concern. He had seen firsthand how much energy and thought she had put into crafting her words, and he understood how important it was to her that the message genuinely help people rather than simply garner positive attention. The authenticity of the responses they were receiving confirmed that she had achieved her goal. The children had their own reactions to seeing their mother's message broadcast worldwide. George, with the analytical mind of a 13-year-old, was fascinated by the technology that allowed one person's words to reach so many people simultaneously. Charlotte seemed most moved by the responses from other children whose parents were facing cancer, and she asked thoughtful questions about whether they might be able to write letters to some of these families. Louis, characteristically, was most impressed by the fact that so many people thought his mother was brave, a sentiment he had never doubted. As the days passed, the initial wave of media coverage gave way to deeper analysis and longer-term impact. Medical journals began publishing editorials about the importance of authentic patient voices in public health communications. Communications scholars analyzed how the princess had managed to be simultaneously personal and universal in her message, creating content that felt intimate despite its global reach. The new initiatives that Catherine had announced during her message began to take shape with remarkable speed. The combination of her personal investment in the cause and the public momentum generated by her message created opportunities for partnerships and funding that might have taken years to develop under normal circumstances. Major pharmaceutical companies, research institutions, and healthcare providers reached out with offers of collaboration and support. One of the most significant developments was the creation of the Catherine Center, a new facility dedicated specifically to providing comprehensive support for cancer patients and their families. The center would offer not just medical care, but psychological support, practical assistance with daily life during treatment, and programs designed specifically for the children and partners of cancer patients. The princess had insisted that this facility be a collaboration between existing organizations rather than a new charity bearing her name, reflecting her understanding that the most important work was being done by people who had dedicated their careers to cancer care long before her own diagnosis. The design process for the Catherine Center became a model for patient-centered healthcare design. Catherine insisted on being involved in every aspect of the planning, drawing on her own experience as a patient to identify features that would make the space genuinely supportive rather than merely impressive. She wanted natural light in every treatment room, comfortable spaces for family members to wait, and play areas designed specifically for children who might spend long hours there while their parents receive treatment. The response from the medical community to Catherine's advocacy was overwhelmingly positive, but it also highlighted some important considerations. Dr. James Peterson, a medical ethicist, wrote thoughtfully about the responsibility that came with having such a powerful platform to discuss health issues. He praised Catherine's approach, noting that she had been careful to share her experience without suggesting it was universal, and had consistently directed people to medical professionals for guidance rather than presenting herself as a medical authority. The conversation about Catherine's message also sparked broader discussions about the role of public figures in health advocacy. Her approach was studied and emulated by other celebrities and public figures who wanted to use their platforms to discuss health issues responsibly. The key elements that made her message effective, scholars noted, were its authenticity, its focus on emotional rather than medical aspects of the cancer experience, and its emphasis on community and connection rather than individual triumph. 6 months after World Cancer Day 2026, the lasting impact of Catherine's message became clear through measurable outcomes. Cancer support organizations reported sustained increases in people seeking help. Medical schools began incorporating her message into curricula about patient communication and empathy. Most importantly, cancer patients and their families continued to reference her words in their own conversations about their experiences. The princess herself had evolved in her understanding of how to use her platform most effectively. She had learned that authenticity was more powerful than perfection, that vulnerability could be a form of strength, and that her personal experiences could serve a purpose far beyond her own healing. She continued to be actively involved in cancer advocacy, but always with the awareness that her role was to amplify existing expertise, rather than to position herself as the center of attention. The World Cancer Day message of 2026 had achieved something unprecedented in royal communications. It had managed to be simultaneously deeply personal and broadly relevant, creating genuine connection across cultures, languages, and life experiences. Catherine had used her recovery not just as a personal victory, but as a foundation for service that would define her role as Princess of Wales for years to come. As she reflected on the impact of that February morning, Catherine understood that her cancer journey had given her something invaluable, the ability to speak with authentic authority about one of life's most challenging experiences. The crown she would one day wear would be important, but the wisdom she had gained through her own struggles had already made her a different kind of royal leader entirely. The message had ended with her promise that no one should face cancer alone, and in the months that followed, she had worked to ensure that promise was more than just words. Through the initiatives she had launched, the conversations she had started, and the community she had helped to build, Catherine had transformed her personal experience of cancer into a legacy of hope and support that would outlast any single World Cancer Day message. In the quiet moments at Adelaide Cottage when the cameras were off and the public attention had shifted elsewhere, Catherine continued to receive letters from cancer patients and families around the world. Each one reminded her that the most important aspect of her royal duties wasn't the ceremonies or state visits, but the simple act of helping people feel less alone in their struggles. Her cancer journey had taught her that true leadership sometimes meant being vulnerable enough to let others see your scars, strong enough to carry their hopes, and wise enough to know that healing was something that happened in community, not in isolation. The Princess of Wales had found her voice, and the world was listening.